Hey everyone, I wanted to touch base with a couple of key takeaways from chapter 14. So, one of the questions I ask on the study guide is getting at this idea of what are the three pathways of generating ATP and how do you know which one is dominant under which conditions? And so, what I'm really getting at here is this slide. So it's slide number 6. And so the thing is, muscle can't store but a very small amount of ATP. And so the body has to constantly, rather the muscles have to constantly regenerate it. There's three ways of doing so. You've got the creatine phosphate system, where that's the quickest, the sort of replenishment of ATP where you're going to see it dominates when you're doing explosive movements, strength training. I included, let's see, this side here dealing with creatine supplementation. And so the idea is that creatine phosphate holds a phosphate group. And so it can give ADP, adenine diphosphate, that third phosphate that it needs, and lo and behold, you get ATP. So it is just one very, very short chemical reaction, and you've got that ATP ready to go. And so you're going to see this creatine phosphate, sometimes referred to as the phosphagen system, dominating during short explosive activities, sprinting, nothing that lasts more than 8 to 10 seconds. The next system is commonly termed either the glycolytic or the lactic acid system. And so with this, the body is predominantly getting its ATP from glycogen that's stored in the muscles. And so when that's broken down, and if there's not enough oxygen present, that's where you get that lactic acid that's made. And so a lot of connections here with that chapter on metabolism. So both creatine phosphate and the glycolytic system, these two are considered in general anaerobic systems. They dominate during activities where you are going to be dealing with shorter, quicker, more explosive movements. This even more so than this. This is kind of an intermediate, if you will. And so in contrast to that, you've got aerobic exercise where ATP can come both from sources of glycogen that you would have in your muscle as well as in the liver. And it's also going to come from fat. So you don't see fats contributing to this sort of exercise, or very, very minimally. And you don't see it contributing here, but very, very minimally. And so those are the three pathways. Let me know if you have questions on that. A quick compare and contrast. So certainly with the aerobic pathway, it takes a little bit longer to generate that ATP because you're going through, if you think about the Krebs cycle on the electron transport chain, there are a lot of steps involved with those, a lot of just mechanical, chemical steps in order to get that ATP. And so it is relatively slow. The advantage is you can break down fats, you can break down lots more carbs. And so you're going to get far, far more ATP, and you're going to be able to sustain the system for significantly longer than you would with the anaerobic system. The advantage of the anaerobic system, of course, on the flip side, is you can make that ATP really quickly. So it's going to be available quite fast. This is another way of looking at these three systems. So this stands for phosphocreatine. This is your glycolytic, and this is your aerobic. And so I took this from a study where they were looking at crewing, so a 2,000-meter rowing race. And they were looking at the different energy systems that's used. So kind of cool. So you're looking at kilocalories per kilogram of the body per hour. And so on the x-axis is time. And during those first 10 seconds, phosphocreatine shoots up, and that's going to be by far the most dominant system in that first period. But here comes glycolytic, and it's going to sustain a little bit longer. And then look at aerobic. So it takes a little bit longer, it takes a lot longer to kick in, but once it does, it can sustain the body, the muscles for quite some time. And so this is what I'm getting at with which system is going to dominate and win. Another key point, so glucose use during physical activity is key, right? So when the glycogen is depleted, that's when the muscles are going to fatigue. So things like hitting the wall in a marathon. It's thought that we carry about 2,000 calories of glycogen for the typical average person in the body. So at about the 20-mile mark in a marathon, somebody's going to hit the wall because they have depleted those glycogen stores if they haven't been replenishing it. So the other key thing I want to talk about for this chapter is this. So I've changed the text here to try to emphasize it. What factors influence how much glycogen is available? And so diet is going to play a part. The more carbohydrates you eat, the more glycogen is going to be available. How long you're exercising, the intensity of exercise, and especially when you're dealing with aerobic activities, a person's training is going to be a big factor as well. So let me hit on these, and then I'll be done. So in terms of the intensity of exercise, I pulled this from one of my ex-phys textbooks. So on that x-axis, you've got how hard a person is working. So exercise intensity, what percent of their VO2 max, right? So this is a person going all out. This is a person, pretty chill walking through here, not conversation pace, right? And up here, you're seeing which substrate. So substrate's just a fancy word for, are you burning fats, carbs, proteins? So what is a person using during these different intensities? So this is kind of a classic crossover representation. So I think this is cool, and I think this explains a lot of questions and misconceptions that people have about fitness and nutrition. So when you're working at lower exercise intensities, you see this whole big shaded column. This is saying that fatty acids, that fats, are the predominant source of energy. So when you're sitting on the couch, you are burning fats. Your muscle, your liver, your major organs, they're using not carbohydrates, but they're using fats. So you're technically in the fat burning zone when you're sitting on your couch. And as you work harder and harder, you start to see that, okay, the carbs start coming into play, more and more carbs start coming into play. And then again, this depends on training, but it's around 70% of a person's VO2 max. You switch over and you start predominantly using carbs, start predominantly using sugars. And the reason for that is that you can make ATP faster by breaking down glucose than you can by breaking down fatty acids. So in other words, when you are working hard, you need that energy faster. So think about like a graded exercise test. So somebody starts off running nice and chill, and every few minutes they get harder and harder and harder. So as they get faster or as they get more intense, they shift over and start using more carbohydrates. So I think that's a cool, important thing to understand about the body and nutrition. Just a couple more points here. And I had this bullet point. So lactic acid production, right? So this also corresponds to, well, probably somewhere around here, is going to correspond to most people's anaerobic threshold, where you start making lactic acid, where you are no longer taking in oxygen quickly enough to break down the glycogen all the way through the Krebs cycle, right? So instead, you go into that lactic acid production. And so hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if it doesn't. And then the last thing I wanted to say here is looking at this idea of exercise duration. So when somebody begins exercising, and this data is kind of limited because you're not seeing exercise intensity in this, but I believe it was a pretty average, we'll say kind of a jogging pace here. So this is looking at percent fat in pink versus percent carbohydrates in blue. And then exercise time in minutes is on the x-axis here. So the longer a person exercises, and we are talking about cardiovascular exercise, nobody's gonna weight lift for 100 continuous minutes, right? So as you continue with that activity, you do typically start burning more and more fats. It's a steadier source of fuel. That's why a lot of athletes like to train their bodies to be more efficient at burning fats, because they become a more dominant source of fuel as you continue. Which isn't to say glycogen isn't important, but they're both going to play a role. So I'll stop it there, but hopefully that answers some questions that you all might have on exercise nutrition. I love this stuff. Hit me up if you have any questions. Thanks.